Alrighty, we'll get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Shah, and I'm the campaign coordinator here at Conservation SA, filling in for Kirsty Bevan, who's been struck down by the flu. I would like to start by saying Marni Nadlu Tampanti, Nadlu Garna, Yartanga Impedenti, which is, in Ghana language, that I recognise that the Ghana people are the traditional owners of these lands and that their sovereignty was never ceded. They were the first scientists and land management managers, and they have their own law, LORE, that they have been using to nourish these lands for tens of thousands of years, and we have much to learn from them. So this event today is co-hosted by the Conservation Council of South Australia, which is the peak body for environment in South Australia, and also the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, which is Australia's peak body for private land conservation. So the purpose of meeting here today is really to share about our state's experience in developing the SA Biodiversity Act so that we can share these lessons with environmental law reform elsewhere in the country. So we'll kind of dive into the political and legislative journey of the bill. We'll talk about the role of SA's environment sector in negotiating some of the key improvements. We'll also talk about some of the important reform proposals that were ultimately not successful and what the lessons are for environmental law reform across Australia, especially in New South Wales and the Commonwealth. So I'm delighted today to introduce a wonderful panel of speakers. We're very pleased to be joined by Deputy Premier of South Australia and Minister for Climate, Environment and Water, Susan Close. Then we'll hear from Michael Cornish, who heads the Australian Land Conservation Alliance's policy and advocacy work. And then we'll hear from Saren Lone, who's Special Counsel at Environmental Defender's Office. So the session is being recorded, and we'll send out a link to the video afterwards. If you have any questions, please do drop them in the Q&A function. I think there's a chat and also a Q&A function. So if you can aim for the Q&A, please do that. You can also ask anonymously, and you can upvote other questions if you're really interested. So drop them in when they come to you, and we'll try and get to them when we can. So now I'll hand over to the Minister. Congratulations, Minister, on the passage of the SA Biodiversity Act. We would love to hear from you about your vision for the implementation and what it can achieve for South Australia.
Great, thank you so much, Shah, and wonderful to be with all of you today, also on Ghana land. I don't want to, I was just having a chat to Michael Cornish beforehand, I don't want to insult everyone's intelligence in trying to tell you exactly what's in this Act, because many of you will know that as well as I do, and some even better. And I also think it's important that after I finish my little presentation that you have a proper discussion about the things you like, but also what you wanted and didn't see and would like to see in other pieces of legislation and improve our legislation over time. So I think that level of detail is something that you all ought to be engaging in. So what I'd like to do is really share with you the narrative that I've been using in describing this to people around South Australia, land users, other politicians and just members of the public, because I think there are two efforts going on right now that we're engaged in collectively. One is in vastly improving the mechanics of how we make decisions about the environment, and the other is the way in which we encourage others to think that the environment matters and understand that it needs to be treated very differently than before. So that kind of second element is more about getting people on board with the importance and the way in which we approach this. The first is the mechanics and the detail of the legislation. So what I've been talking about with many people is this idea of the kind of history of South Australia over time. Now, obviously, we have the Aboriginal people who've lived in this land for time immemorial, who've seen what this land looks like well before the Holocene started, let alone now having to experience the Anthropocene. But about, let's call it 200 years ago, we had the arrival of settlers from far away, mainly European culture, although I acknowledge that there are many cultures that have made up this modern version of South Australia. And when, let's call it for the sake of simplicity, the Europeans arrived, European culture arrived, the approach to the South Australian landscape was based on two fundamental errors, which one might think are understandable, but nonetheless have been proven to have been wrong. One of them was that this landscape was susceptible of becoming like home, like Europe, that it would make sense to treat it in a way that could make this country more familiar. So deer, foxes, monoculture, all of that was a reasonable approach to this land. And the other fundamental mistake that was made was to think of this land as being very resilient, very tough, and needing some aggressive treatment, and not recognising the fundamental fragility of the vast majority of our ecosystems. And of course, those two fundamental errors in looking at our environment were compounded by the complete lack of interest in understanding from Aboriginal people what living in this land for tens of thousands of years was like. So what that added up to was an approach that saw water sources being drained as if they were infinitely able to be replenished, broad-scale clearance, not only as something desirable, but something that was compulsory in the soldier settlement approach. The digging of holes to get rid of pollution in industrial places, all across Adelaide, for example, and tipping bad pollutants into waterways and allowing them to flush out to sea. All of that approach to our landscape caused enormous damage over the last couple of 100 years. Now, what I want people to understand in the broader community is that there has been an incredible amount of progress made through the efforts of people who care deeply about the environment, including many landholders. And from the 70s on, significant amount of legislative reform that made our decision-making better. Legislative reform in the form of national parks and wildlife creating protected areas, the Natural Resources Management Act, now called Landscapes, which prescribed water sources and said if this water source looks like it's going to be drained to the point of non-existence, that we will allocate it and make wiser decisions about how it's shared around and that the environment is nonetheless sustainable. The Environment Protection Act, of course, to stop the extent of pollution, and very importantly, the Native Vegetation Act, which stopped the broad-scale clearance in South Australia. So all of those pieces of legislation should never be diminished for the importance that they have had in the way that we've changed our approach to managing this landscape, and ought to be celebrated, and the people who are behind them should be congratulated. But unfortunately, making wiser decisions from now on about how we affect the environment is insufficient given the amount of damage that's already occurred, the pressure that population has put on, continues to put on, population growth continues to put on, pushing out further and further into nature. And of course, with climate change putting additional pressure, we need to have nature being far stronger than it is now, rather than simply doing very little or no more harm. And I put into this narrative now for all of you, if you haven't had a chance to see Ken Henry's speech yesterday at the National Press Club, I think you would all, and many of you will have, but you will all benefit from seeing such a strong advocate for the proper placement of biodiversity at the centre of decision making, giving such a magnificent speech yesterday. The questions were interesting. Some of them just wanted to talk about the Henry Tax Review of many years ago and weren't interested in talking about nature, but there were others that really connected with what he was pleading for, which was a proper appreciation of the role of nature. So that big shift is what required us to have a Biodiversity Act, this idea of not just resting on our laurels of making much better decisions now, but the need to encourage restoration and better place nature at the centre of decision making. Now, our Biodiversity Act has done that imperfectly, but has certainly done it to a greater extent than existed before. We've brought together the protective mechanisms and the wiser decision making mechanisms that we have in the Native Vegetation Act and the wildlife part of national parks and wildlife. We have increased the levels of protections. We've introduced new ways of thinking about what needs to be protected, such as critical habitat that's critical to the sustainment of the species, for example. So that we've not only done that, we've also done two other things. One is to much more firmly place science at the centre of decision making and require that to be considered earlier. Now that's of course a complex interplay between the planning system and the conservation, and the Biodiversity Act. But as we develop the capacity to provide map-based, place-based information about what is already there, we will see greater decisions being made with the full knowledge of what biodiversity requires. And there are a lot of requirements on me as Minister to gather more information and make that publicly available. That increase in the emphasis on science, I think, will be increasingly valuable. The other element of this, which is so important, is facilitating restoration, creating the capacity to prioritise where restoration can and should occur, and mechanisms to facilitate that happening. Now, some of that will, of course, exist outside of legislation, and some of that may at some point exist through the federal system of biodiversity credits. But the legislation clearly articulates the architecture required for a state-based approach to increasing restoration efforts and rewarding those. Now, the legislation is through. It now requires much work to be done on the subordinate legislation. It will take up to 2 years to fully commence the legislation because of the detail that exists in regulations, in policies and in guidelines. My intention is to commence some very soon, some elements of the legislation, and particularly the creation of the Biodiversity Council and its committees, the Scientific Committee, the Aboriginal Committee, and also at some point, although this is sort of a technical element, when we look at the Clearance Assessment Committee. But importantly, the Biodiversity Council needs to steer this next stage in the creation of the regulations and the policies and guidelines that are required. The idea of having a biodiversity plan that prioritises restoration, that guides the approach to decision making, will be of immense importance. And who we have on that council and the role and licence that they're given will be very important. Underscoring all of that has been an approach to bring Aboriginal knowledge into the centre of biodiversity considerations. And I was very pleased, we recently sent out the final act to all of the entities, the organisations and individuals that have participated in this discussion, whether they were part of ongoing stakeholder workshops or had simply put in a submission through our consultation process publicly. And we had a number of elements of feedback from the Aboriginal communities who welcomed the way in which Aboriginal knowledge has been brought in. And I won't read them out, but just some that made me so proud of the way that the department had approached this, and recognition of the importance of the centrality of bringing Aboriginal knowledge right into everything that we do when we consider our biodiversity. So that was very pleasing to me. Of course, there will be elements, as I've signalled, that the environment movement would rightly think ought to have gone further. When I listened to Ken Henry yesterday, I was contemplating where we had done well by Ken's lights and where we still hadn't quite put biodiversity sufficiently at the forefront of decision making in the way that he would like us to. He is a remarkable South Australian, and we're very fortunate to have him. Australian. I wish he was South Australian. He's an Australian who should be lauded across the political divide. I did want to refer at the end to the problem of the algal bloom that we're having in South Australia. And I hope that everyone across the country has noticed that we're having it. We have, for the last more than 4 months now, had a bloom dominated by a species called Corinia mikimotoi, which is a phytoplankton that suffocates and is toxic to life under the sea that seeks to breathe air under the sea. It's not toxic to mammals, but if you've got gills, if you're trying to breathe under the sea, it is absolutely toxic. And it also is suffocating for life under the sea, under the sea surface, because it sits in a thick blanket and takes oxygen out of the water overnight. That algal bloom has been a moment of reckoning for people in South Australia, and I hope the rest of the country, in understanding that when we treat nature badly and when we change the climate significantly, then sometimes we'll have experiences that we can't halt the course of. This toxic algal bloom, this harmful algal bloom, as the acronym is, the HAB, has not been able to be stopped by people. And when we go back to thinking about the narrative for those of us who care about the environment, it has been obviously very difficult for a number of South Australians to come to terms with something that hasn't been directly caused by an individual mistake by a government and can't be immediately halted by effort by government. So I have often in the media people texting and phoning in saying that it's the desalination plant. The government made a mistake turning on the desalination plant. It's the first time we've had to do it as a drought response, and we should just turn it off. That it was the presence some months ago of a Chinese ship in our waters that brought this here. Because I understand it's much easier to contemplate a problem that has a very simple cause, and it's even nicer for a lot of people if it's a cause that means government's made a mistake, and that with a bit of effort, government could get it right and fix it. And this is not that kind of problem. We can and should do much more and better research and ongoing research, and we are investing significantly in that. We will need to look after those who've been economically affected by it, and we will need to invest in accelerating recovery once the bloom ebbs so that we can see the environment come back as fast as possible. And we will be exploring the edges of science in doing that. How easily can you help a bit of the sea environment recover quickly? We'll be working that out in real time. So it's not that we can't do anything, but we can't stop the bloom once it's started. And that is a hard lesson for people to learn, but is important because we've always had this approach, and Ken Henry talked about it yesterday, that when you make individual decisions about developments in individual places, nature will tend to lose, because it is easy to say, well, there's a lot more nature out there, and often the damage done is over a length of time. So we borrow from the future, and we think that nature's pretty robust because it's pretty big. They are both errors of considerations, and that is coming home to roost right now with the impact of climate change, and will happen much more significantly in places that have already created problems in the resilience of their biodiversity. Bringing those together is a catastrophe. I'm so grateful we have marine parks and sanctuary zones, because it gives us a chance where those sanctuary zones haven't been affected by the bloom, that we'll be able to repopulate from them, for example. The causes of the bloom are threefold, and all three caused by climate change. The first is that we've had a marine heat wave. It's a big marine heat wave happening in the southern hemisphere, but a big marine heat wave that started around September last year in our waters, 2.5 degrees above background. Second cause is that there was an addition of nutrients. Now, there's a little interesting debate occurring amongst the scientists about where those nutrients came from. Most government scientists say that it was the nutrients that washed down the River Murray as a result of those unprecedented floods and dumped a whole lot of organic material into the sea. It's also true that the Bonnie upwelling, which is a fantastic upwelling that even blue whales benefit from in the southeast of South Australia, the Bonnie upwelling came up, cold water brings up a whole lot of nutrients to the surface. You get a lot of plankton that grows and a lot of krill, and you see a lot of whales turn up. But with the heat wave, that got pushed further and for longer towards Kangaroo Island, and it is possible that those nutrients coming in added to the nutrient load. And a third possible source of nutrients is that the heat wave itself boiled a lot of seagrass and seaweed, and that added to the load. Irrespective of where science settles on it, all three of those are driven by climate change. So that's the second element. It's warm and it's nutritious. And then it was like a still bath for a number of months where we had a series of high pressure systems that meant there was no wind, no big ocean movement, and the sun was beating down because we were experiencing a drought and creating the opportunity for phytoplankton to photosynthesize. And those three together appear to have created the perfect conditions for this bloom. And having started, can't stop it. So the Biodiversity Act, immensely important in my view, and it will become more important as we really flesh it out with the guidelines, the policies and the regulations, and I look forward to seeing how they unfold. And I expect the environment movement to be extremely active in contributing to those. But when we talk about these pieces of legislation, they can seem a bit remote and theoretical to people. And it's very important to me to convey to people in South Australia and across the country that we are, as Ken Henry was saying yesterday, at a time where if we don't get it right now, we won't get it right, because we are experiencing the edge of where climate change starts to tip us into significant biodiversity loss. I just saw a restoration as important as, retention is as important as restoration. Yes, I hope I was making that clear. The protection of what exists is absolutely important and beefing that up, but we need to make sure that there's room for, and there's been a lot of restoration done by a lot of good people, but we really need to accelerate restoration as well. Sorry to respond to an individual comment I just saw. So thank you for the role that you all play in making the environment stronger, more resilient. You do it through on-ground works, you do it through advocacy for policy and legislative change, and you also do it through helping people understand that this is not a fringe issue. This is central to how we govern and how we make decisions. My hope and expectation is the Biodiversity Act has contributed to that. I hope it sees a flow-on change in legislation in other states, and also that it helps contribute to building the case for the national legislation. So appreciate it. I'm going to leave because I think what's important is that you'll have a proper discussion about where you want to see improvements. And I thank you very much for everything you do.
Thank you very much, Minister. And we promise not to talk about you too much in your absence. So, no, thank you very much for that. I appreciate your time.
Yeah.
So I might take over now. My name's Michael Cornish. I'm the policy lead at ALCA. We do have, I guess, a reasonably limited amount of time to get through a whole heap of detail. And I guess, though, if you signed up for an environmental law reform, public webinar, then you're up for some detail. So I hope you can bear with me as I take you, I guess, through the journey of what's happened in South Australia with the Biodiversity Act, and then touching upon some of the lessons for environmental law reform before passing over to Seren to flesh out that a bit further. So without any further ado, I'll just give you a bit of an introduction to the organisation I work for, the journey, the SA context, where we got to on the exposure draft bill, the amendments, and then the lessons. So very quickly, Australian Land Conservation Alliance is the peak body for private land conservation. We work to protect, manage and restore nature, and these are our various member organisations. As a peak body, ALCA does all the sorts of things you might expect a peak body to do. That's advocacy, run annual conferences, share information and knowledge across not just our member organisations, but the broader sector. So SA's Biodiversity Act. This is the departments or government, SA government's journey map, as it were. And really, I'm just going to focus on those three bits highlighted in red there. So the discussion paper, the draft bill, and then Parliament. So first of all, though, what's the context here in South Australia? And I'm, for the record, I'm a loud and proud South Australian from the Adelaide Hills. And Look, one thing to note about a jurisdiction that I guess is, smaller in population size than some of our other, interstate jurisdictions is that it's a lot easier for us to have a very well-connected, coordinated and united sector. Everyone, I guess, who is involved in the advocacy space and the technical legislative space all know one another, and we coordinate regularly. Look, I'm as you'll see as we go on, this is not, I guess, a loving comment, but I think it is fair to say that the minister herself has demonstrated a considerable amount of leadership in this space. A committed, accessible minister and her office, and that they've played a straight bat when we've interacted with them. And that political leadership does really matter. But then, as an accompaniment to that, a committed, professional, and accessible public sector. So, our accessibility for our sector and those other sectors that were concerned or had views were certainly very good, as far as I can tell, with the public sector. So, thank you very much to that small but very dedicated team. And then there is a group called the SA Nature Alliance. It's headed up, by the Conservation Council SA. That's sort of a core group of organisations that are working together on these things, in South Australia. But then also the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, of which I work, was critical in delivering this work as well. So what's actually happened? All right, so there's two existing pieces of legislation that one part of the National Parks and Wildlife Act, the wildlife part, which deals with permits and threatened species listings, that bit has been taken out and put into the Biodiversity Act. And then our environmental offsetting and conservation covenants, known as native vegetation heritage agreements in South Australia, those two existing acts were essentially pulled down into the Biodiversity Act. The National Parks part is going to be pushed off for later review, and then there are some new things on top. So, okay, so what are these new things? Not to say that there hasn't been, I guess, reform and refinement of those other two core bits of legislation folded into the Biodiversity Act, but there are new things. So, okay, a general duty not to harm biodiversity. No doubt Sarah will talk about this more, but this is, as I understand it, the first in the country, and that there is, there's opportunities of remedy or restraint where there's a breach, through court orders through the ERD court, the Environmental Resources and Development Court, or Environment Court, essentially. And so this general duty, in a sense, is like a fallback provision for where there may have been a certain harm that, for whatever reason, has not been contemplated through existing legislation. So this is our backstop now that's available through government to be able to bring actions where there's not another pathway that's more appropriate. It does embed First Nations knowledge through a standalone committee, as well as through all the other key committees. We now have a legislative process for listing threatened species and threatened ecological communities. Now, this is not new to other parts in the country, but it is new to us because beforehand it was really a list that was provided to the governor and put out. There wasn't a legislative process for the actual listing. So we now have adopted the proper common assessment method and we have the process legislated. And like we've seen at the federal level in previous attempts at reform, a focus on, on biodiversity data and trying to have a good register and accumulation of that data, as well as a state level biodiversity plan to help inform the key priorities for restoring and protecting and managing our biodiversity. Also increased penalties, other things as well. So, okay, what were some key early concerns? So essentially we're at the discussion paper point where ideas are being floated and the environment sector, got together and went, well, what are our key asks? There's always going to be nitty gritty, but what are our top level asks that were things we'd like to see? So primacy of the Act, and this really featured within the New South Wales independent review of the Biodiversity Conservation Act there, chaired by Ken Henry. And, you can, when we send out these slides, you should be able to click on the link to a Radio National, clip that he did where he explains what primacy of the Act is. But in short form, this is saying that legislation can be all well and good until you look at other pieces of legislation that then carve out chunks of it. So, for example, Ken Henry's comment about the New South Wales legislation was that it was pretty good, but that was until such time as you realised that it was abrogated all over the place by other bits of legislation. So primacy was a key issue. Funding is a key issue. We know that's not something that's very easy to deal with in legislation. Our approach was to suggest that there be an independent statutory conservation trust. They have these in New South Wales and also in Victoria, statutory entities that are part of government that deliver, I guess, a floor of funding for, for private landowners to steward nature on their land. So we're looking at trying to at least create that to create a floor of funding. Environmental offsetting. So in SA, we don't have biodiversity offsetting. We have native vegetation offsetting. It's a reasonable proxy. I'm sure someone who's an ecologist, which is not me, will have a more nuanced view than that. But our concern was that shifting to a mooted biodiversity offsetting would really invigorate the politics around developers and proponents who, having seen what's happened interstate, be particularly concerned around how granular or not this might make the offsetting system, and whether, in essence, it would function as well as we might hope. Now, that's not to say that biodiversity offsetting is a bad idea, but I guess the sector's concern more broadly was that if we were going to have that political argument, we may not have won it. So our general approach was, look, our offsetting is pretty good, although we know the formula is rather woefully underdone in terms of delivering the amount of biodiversity gain that's needed when we do offsetting. But nonetheless, otherwise, it's pretty good in SA. So on balance, we said, let's maybe leave that alone. We did want to incorporate unacceptable impacts in the legislation, basically places where development really just should not occur. So, those obviously highly critical areas for biodiversity. And I've mentioned there about improving the offsetting formula itself. As well as delivering, I guess, a net positive approach like we're seeing in New South Wales. We wanted to see third-party standing so that concerned members of the community will be able to help enforce the Act where, for whatever reason, the government or others who currently have standing were unable or unwilling to act. And we do actually have these provisions already in a couple of pieces of SA legislation, as you can see there. And I guess if Nixon back in 1970 can create a third-party standing in the Environmental Protection Act over in the US, the Trump of his time in the 1970s, then surely we can do the same thing in different Australian jurisdictions. We also wanted to shift the objects of the Act from this, old way of thinking around ecologically sustainable development. We wanted to focus on delivering positive outcomes for nature, that it wasn't about delivering positive outcomes for development, whilst that's something that needs to be considered in the development pathways, that Biodiversity Act should focus on biodiversity, not merely be a subset of some other, of development. And we asked for it, we expected it to include the precautionary principle. Okay, then we got to the exposure draft bill. So where did we land on those key concerns? Well, on the primacy of the Act, we didn't land the primacy of the Act. And truth be told, we knew that it was going to be pretty unlikely that the SA government would come at that. And indeed, there was something that I guess in the sector we described as the loophole. And look, ultimately, the loophole was addressed, and I guess when we started hearing some of our fellow stakeholders in government talk about it as the loophole, we knew that it was something that was going to be addressed. So this is something where I guess the sector, or in this case, myself, I went out to, I guess, a niche publication, not niche for people who follow the carbon market, but niche from a broader perspective, called Carbon Pulse, and raised the concern over this particular loophole because, and I should explain what it is, the loophole that was in the draft legislation would have allowed the government of the day to abrogate or vary Biodiversity Act whenever and if they so chose. And that was clearly a dramatic step backwards. And I must confess, I didn't, we ultimately were told that this was in essence an oversight. And it must have confessed, it didn't occur to me that it was an oversight at the beginning. Nonetheless, obviously the message was heeded, and that loophole was ultimately fixed. But we didn't get primacy of the Act. On funding, so we don't have an independent statutory conservation trust here, and obviously for a smaller financially capable jurisdiction like South Australia, there's always going to be that hurdle of the stumping up the capital, as it were, to start one of these trusts off. However, we do at least have a regulatory head of power to create it. It's not how you create a statutory organisation generally, but there is technically a way to do it. On environmental offsetting, so it stuck with native vegetation offsets in the end. There was a bit of tinkering around, around the edges and so on. Some things which were positive, some things which were negative, but broadly speaking, the existing offsetting system is largely intact. We didn't get the no-go zones, the unacceptable impacts, but we did get critical habitat, i.e. areas that could be declared, ultimately, however, at the discretion of the minister, as being places that are so critical to habitat that there should be a much higher threshold to contemplating their destruction. So it doesn't prevent their destruction, but it does make it a lot harder for their destruction once declared to proceed. And as I mentioned before, we didn't get a net positive approach, building in a nature positive premium in our offsetting formula. But nonetheless, the formula itself, remains under review. We did get third-party standing for breaches of the Act, but not for the general duty. The objects do now focus on delivering positive outcomes for nature. They shifted away from that outdated ESD frame, as recommended in the New South Wales Independent Review, and we've got the precautionary principle. But there were some curveballs. So as I say, I don't want to make this sound like the whole thing was, all sweetness and light. There's always going to be things that we weren't so happy with. Now, in no particular order, the nomination process for the Biodiversity Council. So previously we had a Native Vegetation Council, in fact it still exists, and there's a series of nominating organisations that put forward people that then the minister selects from to put on that council. So there is a balance here, I guess, around trying to make sure there's civic representation, or at the very least knowledge, because technically you're not representing, you have to act on behalf of that council, of course. But that there was an understanding of different civic sectors, agriculture, local government, conservation, in that council. And our other concern was around trying to avoid political stacking. So the attempt was to make it all skills-based, and there's nothing wrong with skills-based, very pro the idea of having expertise on these sorts of bodies. But the danger then was that the minister was going to get to decide on every single person appointed to the council. And previous experiences in South Australia indicate that would have been a very bad idea. So anyway, we'll see where that landed. The offset policies, particularly the actual offsetting formula itself, was going to be in the hands of the minister. That was particularly concerning. The threatened species listing process, as well as the threatened ecological community listing process, was going to be in the hands of the minister, whereas we would argue that it should have been in an independent scientific committee. And then the area where that native vegetation offsetting applies was also going to be determined by the minister. Technically, that is sort of the case at the moment, and I won't go through the complexity of it, but it's a sort of ad hoc, on an exception, on an exception by exception basis, not a broad-based, we're going to just change the area, when and if we so choose. And lastly, that the pastoral land, which is about, 42% of South Australia, the grazing regimes were going to be not determined through a normal clearance approvals process. So there were some pretty big concerns, actually, in what came out in the exposure draft. So, all right, let's have a look then at the parliamentary context. So we had discussions with all sides of Parliament, as you might imagine. The Liberals were broadly not supportive, but the Greens and former Greens member were supportive. So Rob Sims and Tammy Frank. And so we crafted together, with the help of, obviously of political representatives, a unity ticket on these negotiated amendments. We've got 2 new objects amendments. There was 1 Liberal amendment that did get adopted in the end, and then I guess one that we didn't want. And I mentioned the one we didn't want as a consequential amendment to another bill that we knew was something that was on the government's radar. It hadn't, for whatever reason, gone onto their radar, and in good faith, we mentioned it because we knew that was their intention, even though we didn't really want it. But with the purpose of, I guess, playing that straight bat, because when people play a straight bat with you, playing a straight bat back is usually the best way to deal with them. Okay, so where do we get to on those, I guess, particularly big concerns that we saw in the draft legislation? Well, we did manage to get the nominee process back in for the Biodiversity Council, the new, sort of, I guess, peak organisational or institutional body within this Act, but not quite as fully as before. Now, those nominees have 2 bites at the opportunity of providing names, and then if the minister's not satisfied after those 2 lots of names are provided, then the minister ends up appointing. So it's not a perfect outcome. We do have now those offsetting policies, specifically the formula, in the hands of the Biodiversity Council. That is particularly critical because that is the price setting mechanism, right? There's the price setting mechanism for offsets. And if that's in the hands of the minister, even the most supportive minister is very unlikely to increase the cost of clearing vegetation when they're trying to balance concerns around housing and, they've got special interest groups knocking at their door saying, oh, we want to pay a bit less for clearing out all the trees and ecosystems. So that was a key win. We did also manage to negotiate for the scientific committee within this act to have control over that threatened species listing and threatened ecological communities listing process. In our view, these are matters of science, and then what government does as a response, what's their recovery plan, what's the funding and so on, that's a policy response. That's the political and policy response that the minister is wholly appropriately assigned. So this is now independently assessed, which is great. On where the offsetting actually applies in South Australia, that sort of spatial layer, we got partway there, essentially saying that whenever they want to make changes, they would have to engage in a reasonably lengthy public consultation on those changes so that we can at least, the environment sector, or for that matter, anyone in the community can mobilise to say, no, you shouldn't change it the way in which you so choose, whether enlarging it or reducing it. And we ended up having a reversal of that pastoral land grazing issue. Plus, we got 2 new, very valuable objects. So we, focusing on you can have a look at these, I guess, in detail later, but positive outcomes for nature were really critically included. But also, and I guess this is a nod to the current discussions going on at the federal level at the moment, where the word climate apparently scares, is, I guess, a scary term, for our federal legislators. But climate considerations are a key feature of the objects of our Act. And so I would say that there's no reason why they couldn't be in federal legislation, because, that's actually a problem we're trying to deal with, climate change. There's a general duty, which is, it's, I guess, first in the country. And so that is, and I'll leave that to Sarah to talk about in more detail. Again, putting scientific decisions in the hands of scientists and political decisions in the hands of politicians, and then also scaffolding those decisions with, I guess, clear public interest criteria that then is transparently reported on. So we got partway there with the critical habitat declaration. It does require a lot of transparency around how those ministerial decisions are made. I would argue that one should be in the hands of scientists, but it wasn't ultimately. But nonetheless, it's still a good step forward. So really, big surprise, governance really matters. And then just very quickly on the process, I mean, look, the usual things, in crafting these things, it needs leadership and judgment and, finesse, not just from the, from the ministers, but also, of course, on all sides of trying to reach a practical, pragmatic outcome that advances things. We did have particularly accessible decision makers. The environment sector did have our meeting with the Premier and a whole swathe of meetings with the Deputy Premier. And again, that coming up with pragmatic solutions. So especially in the final drafting stages, being able to sit with public service, through line by line with the bills, to go, well, have you considered this? This might solve that problem, and I understand that the environment sector wasn't the only, stakeholder that got that opportunity. So that was exceptionally valuable, and we're very thankful for that. Also, just that there was a general understanding, perhaps maybe tacit understanding around lots of input from the environment sector, but then making sure that there are some key people who are going to carry the work all the way through, and at the level of detail it requires. So a final comment there, I guess, that success has many authors, but then of course so does tragedy. So there was a lot of authors of success in this process. And then very last of all, of course, actually turn up. And so this is me on the day that the legislation was going through the LegCo, running through the amendment sheets, making sure that everything was crafted correctly and all the speaking notes were in order for our wonderful crossbenchers. So that's really all that there is from me. We'll obviously do some Q&A after Sarah has had the chance to speak. So I've tried to go as quickly as possible, Sarah, noting we don't have a lot of time left, but over to you.
Thanks, Michael. I'm just going to share my screen quickly now. Here we go. We see that now? Yep, great. Wow, that was a fast and detailed presentation there from Michael. I'm sure if anyone's missed anything, Michael and I, can probably stay online for a bit past our end time and see if we can answer some of those questions. It was great to have the Minister be so sparing with her time, and it was great to hear from her about her vision for what's happening down there in South Australia. So I'm going to take a bit of a step outwards now and look at some of the legal issues that are emerging in biodiversity law reform broadly across Australia, reflecting on what's just happened in South Australia and noting, as Michael mentioned, that we've also got reform processes happening in New South Wales and at the federal level as well. So I have the benefit of sitting in EDO's National Policy and Law Reform team. So I have that unique perspective of being engaged in law reform processes in each jurisdiction. There are definitely some key themes that I'm seeing emerge across the board. Some of the issues that the South Australian government was grappling with as it developed its bill are also being discussed by the New South Wales and federal governments. I can see that there are a few questions in the Q&A already that touch on some of the key issues that I'm going to talk about. And people are rightly questioning, it's great that we've got these things in the bill, but how effective are they going to be in practice? And that's a really important question to be asking. So just as a recap, in New South Wales, we've got the New South Wales Government's Plan for Nature, which sets out the government's vision for protecting biodiversity and ecosystems, including reforms to the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Act. And at the federal level, I'm sure people are aware, we've got a commitment to reform the EPBC Act there. That was originally set out in the federal government's Nature Positive Plan, and more recently confirmed by the new Federal Environment Minister, Murray Watt. So we've got all those processes happening off the back of what's been going on in South Australia as well. So there are a few emerging issues that we're seeing across the board for nature law reform in Australia. So the first one is this real need to update the objects of our biodiversity laws to make sure that they reflect national and international policy ambition. So we had the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework agreed to by countries all over the world in late 2022, and there were some really key goals there, including halting and reversing extinctions and recovering ecosystems. But what we find looking at the objects of our laws here in Australia is that our objects don't match that ambition. And even with the New South Wales laws, which had only been in place for 5 years when the review happened of the New South Wales Act, it was already found that the objects of that Act were out of date. So what we're seeing now is government starting to update the objects of the Act and starting to bring in some of these international ambitions around halting and reversing extinctions and recovering ecosystems. And that's something that we saw in South Australia, and that's discussions that are being had with the federal government and New South Wales governments as well. One of the other things we're starting to see is this idea of a whole of government strategy and targets for nature conservation and restoration. So the Deputy Premier mentioned this about a state biodiversity plan for South Australia, and that's now in the Biodiversity Act there. In New South Wales, the government's committed to a New South Wales nature strategy, which will again be a whole of government strategy for biodiversity conservation and set targets for nature conservation and restoration. And if you think of this similar to the way government started to bring in climate strategies, there were a whole of government strategy and set climate targets. We're now starting to see governments starting to do that in terms of biodiversity and starting to set whole of government strategy and targets for biodiversity conservation. We haven't seen a lot of the detail yet, but the fact that they're willing to make legislative change to have these strategies and put these targets in place is a positive step forward. I know there's still a lot of work to be done in South Australia and New South Wales in terms of developing those strategies and those targets, but what it does is it's putting, hopefully, biodiversity conservation front of mind for governments. Instead of having environment matters sit over here in just the environment portfolio, we're now seeing it broaden out to be something that whole of government needs to be striving towards through that state biodiversity strategy and any targets that are set. And that links to my next point about stronger interaction between nature laws and land use decisions. So historically, I guess we've seen nature laws sit over here, and we've had decisions made about protected areas and national parks and threatened species listings, and then decisions being made over here on the other hand on land use such as planning, land clearing, etc. And there was quite poor interaction between those two frameworks. And so we'd often have the Environment Department over here trying to achieve certain outcomes for the environment, but no real strong connection to the decisions that are being made about the way we use our land. And hopefully by having a whole of government strategy and targets for nature conservation, we will start to see both of these sides of the coin work towards a common goal. And we really need to see legislation make sure that decisions that are being made over here on land use decisions such as planning, land clearing, etc., now start to work towards those whole of government targets. And really we need to say, well, if you're making decisions, they need to be consistent with that strategy, and you need to make sure you're meeting those targets, or else we're going to continue to have that the same scenario we've had in the past, where we've got two different frameworks operating without talking to each other, and we often see the environment lose out to those decisions that we're making over here around our land use. One of the other key things that governments are grappling with is around this idea about how the law can generally protect habitat. And so Michael's already talked about the critical habitat provisions that came in South Australia, having no unacceptable impacts, or whether you can identify your areas of high conservation value upfront in your strategic planning. I guess there's multiple ways you can skin a cat, but at the end of the day, what we really need is laws that provide genuine protection for habitat. And until we do that, then we're going to keep facing these issues that we have faced historically, where we've got discretionary decision making that leads to impacts on habitat that really can't be sustained moving forward. And we're talking about the types of habitat where our critically endangered species live, and they need those habitats to survive. So in South Australia, the government went down the path of introducing new critical habitat provisions. And for those of you who've seen how those operate in other jurisdictions, you might be a bit sceptical as to whether they're going to work, because we do have critical habitat provisions in other jurisdictions in Australia, but they just haven't been working. In some of those jurisdictions, no critical habitat has been declared under those provisions. In some other jurisdictions, only a handful of critical habitat. I think the thing is, when you've got mechanisms that are discretionary and ministers can choose to do things or not do things, then we're faced with the problem that they can be underused. And so for those people in the chat that were saying, well, what's different about these particular provisions? I think there's still a bit of a, well, let's wait and see, how effective they'll be in practice. The South Australian government has done things slightly differently here, in that they have introduced a requirement for the minister to at least turn her mind to whether or not to declare critical habitat, and that's at least one step forward than some other jurisdictions that don't even require the minister to even make a decision as to whether or not to declare something as critical habitat. So that's one step forward, but I think we still need to wait and see how effective these are. I think Michael alluded to the fact that unacceptable impacts was something discussed with government but not put into the legislation. I think that's something that we need to keep talking to governments about. This idea that at some point our legislation has to say, no, there are impacts that are unacceptable and we can't allow those impacts to happen. It's discussions that are being had at the federal level and in New South Wales as well. New South Wales does have a mechanism for serious and irreversible impacts, which is essentially the same thing, unacceptable impacts, but it can still be made stronger so that you have that real red flag in your laws to say, actually, these impacts are unacceptable and cannot go ahead. And then in terms of areas of high conservation value identified upfront in strategic planning, whether they're called that or no-goes or something else, I don't think we quite got there in South Australia in terms of having, mapped no-go areas. The critical habitat provisions was where they landed. But again, I think discussions need to be continued at the federal level and in New South Wales about how we identify those areas and what legal protection we provide for them in our laws. Offsets, Michael talked about briefly, but my views on this is that they must be based on best practice, so like for like offsets, and they must deliver environmental outcomes. In the case of South Australia, we still need to see the offsets policy developed. So the new Act provides the framework for that, but it'll be the Biodiversity Council that will then develop up the policy. So we still need to keep our eye on where the rules end up in South Australia and whether we stick to that strict like-for-like offsetting, or whether there's going to be variations or payments for destruction where proponents can essentially pay money to offset their obligations to compensate for the damage without there being real and genuine offsets in place to compensate for that damage. I think discussions are continuing in New South Wales and at the federal level as well about how those offsets frameworks are going to land. Another thing that the Minister touched on as well was this idea about co-designing biodiversity and land management with Aboriginal peoples. And that's something that all governments have been keen to progress, but we're still seeing that in its infancy. So in South Australia, the government's put in an Aboriginal Biodiversity Council. It's yet to be established, and it will drive a lot of the work that will happen there in South Australia. Similarly, I think New South Wales is still figuring out exactly how it's going to meet its vision of bringing Aboriginal peoples better into the biodiversity framework there. Still a lot of work to be done and something to keep an eye on. The general duty not to harm biodiversity. So Michael mentioned this. It is the first time that we've seen a general duty not to harm biodiversity in Australian law. We've got similar duties, as people have pointed out in the Q&A, in our biosecurity laws, in our pollution and waste laws. There's a duty in the South Australia Landscape Act already. I guess the question here is, well, it's great that it's in the Act, but how effective is it going to be in practice? And people are already reflecting on the fact that general duties that we have in law at the moment are pretty hard to enforce. They're not often used. And so I think it's a similar case here in South Australia. Good that it's in there, but what can we do to actually make sure that this new general duty is effective on the ground? And the last point I just wanted to make was around restoration and removing legal obstacles. So the Minister did mention this is something that she was happy with, that the South Australian Act did do more for restoration. But I think it's still, again, something we need to keep our eye on to see how it rolls out in practice. What I'm finding is that a lot of our laws across Australia aren't geared up for really facilitating restoration. And what we're actually finding is there are legal obstacles in the way for rolling out restoration projects on the ground. So it's something that we need to pay attention to as the South Australian Bill is implemented, and something we also need to look closely at as New South Wales and the federal government go through its reform processes. The last thing I would just say here on implementation is it's great that we've got this vision, but again, as people have mentioned in the Q&A already, how do we make sure these laws stick and how do we make sure these laws work? I don't think the Minister mentioned anything about funding and whether there's going to be, increased funding from the government to implement this new Act, and whether there's going to be increased capacity within the agencies that are going to be tasked with implementing this Act or enforcing this Act. So it's great that, we've put words on paper and we've got this through the Parliament, but in practice, there still needs to be quite a bit of commitment by governments to back in their reforms with significant funding to deliver the vision that they want to see. I'm just going to leave it there, Michael, because I know we're running short on time. I think you've been monitoring the chat there, so hopefully you can... Oh, sorry, I do have a couple more tips for lawmakers. Sorry, I had one more slide. This is just reflecting on the process as Michael did. Some tips for lawmakers, because we might have some of them on the call, some departmental officers or people from ministers' offices listening in. So from my point of view as a stakeholder involved in these processes, similar to Michael, engage early with stakeholders. Don't leave it till you've got, your bill before the Parliament. It's really important to seek stakeholder engagement and feedback early. Value the expertise of your stakeholders. There's a lot of knowledge out there. People are passionate about this topic. People have worked in this space for a long time, and there's a lot of expertise out there, and people are willing to give their time. So really value that expertise that you can get from your stakeholders. Provide information to help stakeholders understand the changes. So for example, detailed explanatory papers or even tracked change versions of amendments. And I will be a little bit critical of the South Australian process here, because I did find it that some of that information for stakeholders was quite high level, and it was really hard for us to engage in the detail when we had to trawl through 150 pages of legislation and try and understand what's changed between one version and the other. Governments that are able to provide that information to stakeholders, it's really useful for them, because then it allows us to spend our time actually engaging in the content rather than trying to figure out what we need to understand. And again, provide reasons for your decisions or approach. So as stakeholders, we want to provide really useful feedback to you. And if you've ruled out an option for a particular reason, it's really good for us to know that, so we don't waste our time kind of developing up an argument for something that you've already thought through clearly yourselves. If we know that, then we're more likely to be able to target our feedback to you that's in a more productive way for the discussions that you've already had. All right, Michael, I'll leave it there. Back to you.
I might jump in quickly, and then I'll pass on to Michael for some questions, as we are a little bit over time now. Lots to pack in, but I firstly just want to really thank the presenters for their wonderful expertise and to the audience for their interest. There are several hundred of you online today, so it really shows how critical this is. And yeah, just a reminder that the session was recorded and it will be sent out afterwards. We obviously didn't get heaps of time for Q&A, so if you do have time and you have some burning questions that you'd like answered, Sarah and Michael will kindly be sticking around for a little bit longer to answer some of those questions. So I'll hand over to Michael now.
Thanks so much, and thank you so much for the presentation, Sarah. I have been furiously typing away. I've gone through 17 thus far in my sort of rapid typing, but we'll try to now pick up on some of the key ones that, or the most upvoted ones, I guess that I've missed. Sarah, you partially answered this already. If I could throw this to you about how restoration is rewarded in the legislation, that's come up as a theme a number of times in the questions.
I did see that question. I'm not sure that it's rewarded in the legislation, but I think the minister made the point that there's a lot of work that needs to be done outside the legislation. So I think there, in terms of restoration, it really is about those incentives for landholders to get involved in restoration projects, and goes to my point about what additional funding and capacity building and on-ground services can the government provide to support the package as a whole. So it might not necessarily be a legislative change that's needed, but whether it's kind of on-ground programs or things like that that can be rolled out to complement the legislation that can really drive that restoration. But then also looking as to whether there's any legal barriers, whether it be in the Biodiversity Act or other acts, your planning framework or somewhere else, that's really stopping those restoration projects from being carried out, and making sure that you address those legal barriers as well.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I might take this next question here from Mary Morris about the concern that, look, it's going to take about 2 years to switch on the different elements of this Biodiversity Act. It's not all starting all at the same time. It's going to be switched on progressively. And the concern is that, well, in the time it takes for it to be switched on, isn't there still going to be all these inappropriate large-scale developments that the Act has been developed to constrain? So look, the quick answer on this is that the offsetting process, so environmental offsetting, is where a developer wants to, for their development, clear some native vegetation in South Australia. That process is largely not changing. There are some changes, but largely speaking, it's not changing, with the exception of the addition of that critical habitat provision, which at this stage, it's hard to be able to tell whether it will be utilised a lot or a little. So what that means is that you're not actually going to see a dramatic change in how the development process works. Having said that, one thing that is new is that something called the mitigation hierarchy. So that's the the step-by-step process that those who are assessing the clearance applications need to consider. That is now being legislated. So that means we have to look at avoiding and minimising and restoring, and ultimately the last one being the payment into an offset fund. So that is now legislated rather than being within administrative policy. So that's been elevated. But by and large, the development process is not changing. Is that fair, Sarah? Do you want to add to that?
No, I think that's a good summary, Michael.
No worries. There is an interesting one here from Tony saying that promoting halting and reversing biodiversity loss is not the same as the halting and reversing biodiversity loss. Yes, absolutely. That was, I guess, the compromise outcome, because we know that in practice, halting and reversing biodiversity loss would, might require some pretty hard decisions by the state government, in terms of what they then would not be able to allow. I guess if you were being, a bit broader in your, if you're looking at this more holistically, it is appropriate for the government to be able to make a decision around where something for the community is more important than the biodiversity that might be damaged as a result of the alternative being going ahead. So I don't think it's unreasonable for the government to be able to have that mechanism. We're not going to be able to, continue as a society without ever chopping down one more tree. But I think it's in the broad about saying enough is enough. We now actually need to build back rather than let the decline continue to happen. So, all right. The next question. Sorry, my little Q&A here keeps refreshing, so I lose the top one from time to time. Here from Catherine. Good to see you on the call, Catherine. Interested in how land clearing through pastoral grazing will be dealt with in the new Act. I note the pastoral lands are included in the Act, but how will water points, spreading and grazing be assessed? The quick version is it's the status quo. It's the status quo. There may be some slight nuances, but the suggested change, which would have allowed, I guess, the pastoral board to take on the native vegetation concerns through land condition assessments. That proposed change has been reversed, and the concern was largely that whilst land condition assessments in the pastoral estate are well and good, they weren't going to put sufficient priority on native vegetation and biodiversity because we knew that was only but one element in what's been considered for land condition. So yes, that's been reversed. All right. Will the biodiversity? This is from Mary Morris. Will the Biodiversity Act and regs have more teeth to compel developers to avoid critical habitat rather than proceed with impunity? So yes, because of the mitigation hierarchy being legislated, perhaps there is, as I say, that critical habitat provision, but it really remains to be seen to what extent those critical habitat provisions will be utilised. So I think the answer is we're not sure yet, but there's no guarantee. What else have we got here? Sorry, from Katie. I understand SA has a health in all policies policy. Have any health indicators made it into the new Biodiversity Act? No. Saren, there's no, I haven't missed that. Okay, good. No, there's not.
But I would just point out there's still a lot of stuff to be written yet in the policies and in the regulations and the guidelines. So, the door's not closed yet for stakeholders who, there's lots of good ideas here in the Q&A. And so I think there's still opportunity for stakeholders to put forward some of these ideas, and they could potentially sit, in those more detailed regulations and policies under the framework legislation.
And that's a very good point. Do please watch if you're South Australian or even if you're interstate and you're just interested in good environmental policy, do have a look at your SA website. They will be required to put any of the proposed regulations under the Biodiversity Act out for public consultation, in the coming months and a couple of years before the Biodiversity Act switches on. So there may be opportunities to push, to advocate for some of those issues. Can we have a copy of the questions and comments? I'm not sure whether it gets recorded or not. I'll have a look about whether we can send that out after the fact. It depends on whether we can get through the wall. So, but we'll see what we can do about that. From Stephen Morris, Minister Close did a great job explaining the causes of toxic algal bloom. Okay, that's just a comment. All right, thank you. No, thank you for that. This is about state biodiversity comprised of a 44% proposed increase in Greater Adelaide's population by 2050. I assume you mean is compromised there. So, I mean, yes, are there going to be pressures from urban development? Absolutely. And we see that across the country. That's certainly not unique to South Australia. And of course, one of the things we need to watch closely is this native vegetation offsetting layer. It's sort of the part of the state where you have to get a clearance approval for destroying or damaging native vegetation. that we need to be sure that that layer doesn't just get shrunk every single time they want to do a new development on the periphery of Adelaide. So it's something to watch. All right, Alex, is this reform really a fundamental change to the way the law protects biodiversity, or at its heart, more of the same? Throw to you on that one, Saren.
That's the question, isn't it? Look, I think it's steps forward. I don't think there's necessarily anything backwards here that I've seen, but I think it's small steps forward in the right direction. I expect, from the comments on the chat here that people have made their own conclusions that, it might not go quite far enough, and that there's still questions around, some of these new things that have made it into the Act, whether they're actually going to deliver outcomes on the ground. If you listen to what Ken Henry said in New South Wales, where he said we need to give the Biodiversity Conservation Act primacy there, this Act doesn't go as far as Ken Henry has said biodiversity acts need to go, but it is making changes for the better. And I think that it's really important that stakeholders keep agitating government to do more. It sounds like the Deputy Premier, the Minister, she's seems passionate about her portfolio, and she, as Michael said, is willing to hear from stakeholders. So continue to raise the concerns and the questions you have coming up with the chat. Don't think that this is the end of the story. It's just one part in a longer journey to making sure that we've got the laws that we need to really address the challenges that we're facing, and to meet that ambition that the international community has set for reversing biodiversity decline.
Thanks. Katya has made a comment here that offsets and restoration, while important, cannot compensate for primary biodiversity loss, and we should not act as if they do. Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. I mean, the entire environment sector and ARCA as well, know that environmental offsetting is not working in practice. That's why we need to build in, I guess, that nature positive premium, so that, we get, I guess, as much bang for buck when there is going to be destruction. So absolutely agree. Anonymous attendee has said, is it a concern that so much of the detail about how the Act will operate will depend so heavily on regulations? I have a view on this, but Sarah, do you want to give this a go?
Well, my personal view is that we should have as much of it in the legislation as possible. The legislation is the, it's the will of the Parliament, and the more you leave into the regulations and the policies, etc., the less oversight you see, and the easier it is for those things to change. So my view would be as much of it in the legislation as possible. That said, I know the government was keen to get this bill in fast, and it takes a lot of work. So I guess the compromise is, let's get something in, and then we can work, through those regulations and policies. But as the Minister said, it could take up to 2 years for that to happen. That's my view on that one. Michael, how about you?
Yeah, look, I generally concur. I mean, look, there's definitely a tendency, certainly in the federal space, where I'm usually focusing my time and effort on an increasing reliance on regulation rather than the primary legislation. So it is something to watch out for, especially when, you might have a concern that there are, I guess, undisclosed intentions that will then only come out when the regulations come out. So that's why we've got to keep watching this quite closely. So, all right then, and I mean, I don't know how much longer you have, Saren, to continue. We've got a full 33 more questions to go. I don't know that we'll make it all the way through. Maybe we'll give it another 5 minutes or so, and do a few more. Yeah, that's okay. Thanks so much, Saren. This one from Diane: will developers be required to adhere to the Act for Mount Barker? Well, future developments in any growth areas. Mount Barker happens to be close to where I live. The answer is yes. Yes, they will, unless they were to change the native vegetation layer, which we've got to watch closely to make sure that they don't exclude places like Mount Barker. Another one from Stephen. Minister Close also noted that government cannot directly affect the bloom. All right. I'll take that, I think, as a comment, just because the algal bloom is quite specific. So by all means, do get in touch afterwards if you want to ask some questions about the algal bloom. I'm not personally an expert on it, though obviously I've been watching it quite closely from as best I can. How does the Act mesh with carbon farming? That's an interesting question, Sarah, and not sure that it does explicitly. It doesn't disallow it. I know that there's one issue that's not resolved in this Act, which actually comes under our Landscape South Australia Act, where biodiverse carbon farming, so if you want to recreate, I guess, a ecosystem, but then also claim carbon credits for it, you need water allocations because it counts as commercial forestry. That is a particular issue that really does stop biodiverse carbon farming from proceeding in the way that it might be able to in other jurisdictions. But the Act itself, if I missed anything, Sarah, I don't think there's anything specifically around carbon farming.
Not specifically in the Act itself. No, I'm just wondering if you might know this more than me, Michael, around the biodiversity agreements that are in the Act, or whether they play any role in, carbon farming projects. I'm not sure.
I mean, there could be potential scope for, but I don't think that's what's envisaged at this stage. So, Paul's asked what sort of research is required before the minister says yes or no to a critical habitat request. Well, I can only really point to where in the legislation it talks about the sorts of things that the minister has to contemplate and give reasons related to. Sarah, you might be able to provide a little bit more detail, but I mean, that really is the extent of what they're required to have before them. But then that doesn't mean the minister can't have additional research that the department would no doubt be providing to her and other external experts that they commission.
That's right. I think it's Part 6, Division 5 of the Act that deals with critical habitat. But I think the criteria is going to be in the regulation for what would meet the criteria for critical habitat. So I think we still need to wait and see as to what the scientific criteria are that the minister needs to look at to form her decision.
So a comment here from Ange about why wouldn't agriculture be invited to co-design as some of the largest landholders and not just First Nations. So there is going to be representation from primary producers SA on the Biodiversity Council. So they are embedded, as is a nominee that comes from the Conservation Council of SA within that primary decision-making body under the Act. So they are, in a sense, invited. But and I think the First Nations committee, I'm not giving it its right name, is co-design. It's a question about whether it's actually co-design or it's providing expert advice. So it depends. But I guess my short answer is there are ways in this Act for different key landholding stakeholders to be involved and have their views aired and heard. Mind you, just like with any sort of legislation that the government, any government implements, civil society always needs to shout rather loudly to make sure that they're being heard. So, I think if there are things that have particularly concerned you, it's just like we always do. As an advocate myself, you have to, I guess, make sure that your concerns are being heard. We're running up to time, so I'll just quickly refresh and make sure we get the last couple here. From Carol. Hello, Carol. Good to see you on the call. Without the Biodiversity Act having primacy, how can biodiversity, native flora and fauna be protected and enhanced under the current state planning code, which prioritises built development? Well, and this is it. We know how the balance operates currently with the existing, planning legislation we have in South Australia, and so I wouldn't want to say that I'm sanguine about it, but it's known what the balance is. But of course, you're quite right. The danger is that there could be future changes to other pieces of legislation that basically say, oh, well, the Biodiversity Act won't apply in this particular case. And as an example of that, there's the State Development Coordination and Facilitation Act, which has recently passed the South Australian Parliament, which allows, the Premier, through a Coordinator General, to designate areas of state development, which can then essentially abrogate or vary quite considerable sections of the Biodiversity Act. So, so in fact, there is that ongoing threat. So no, you're quite right. There isn't necessarily a permanent positive balance here. I have no idea about whether the SA government will designate the algal bloom as a natural disaster. So very sorry, that one will have to go to Minister Close, or maybe to the federal government. And then one here to do with EPBC. Okay, it's critical that state and federal laws work together, as from Andrew. Oh, good to see you, Andrew. looking forward to seeing what happens with EPBC reform, but what about Nature Repair Bill and Nature Positive? Have these components been dropped for now, and how do they work in with the State Biodiversity Act? Okay, so the long story short is that there is no explicit nature positive element in the SA Biodiversity Act. There is also there's also certainly no I guess barrier to the Nature Repair Act operating in South Australia. I mean, there's probably some things that need to happen around property titles and so on for it to be implemented in practice. But no, there's no barrier. I guess within the State's Biodiversity Act from those federal reforms or federal legislation being able to have impact here. Certainly not to my knowledge. Sarah, it's a complicated question. Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you've answered it well.
That's very kind. Look, I think we might take the very last question here, and I'm just going to look at this short one, sorry, because we're running out of time. From Jared here, will councils be invited to contribute to the development of the State Biodiversity Plan? So I'd have to double check on the provision for that, but there is a consultation process. So I'm very sorry, I have to very quickly check. It is contained within section, 173 from memory? Yep, 173. There will need to be public consultation in a manner that the minister considers appropriate. So whether they very specifically have to go to the local councils is a different matter, but they will need to do a public consultation of some sort. So, all right, I think we've done a marathon of questions, and really sorry to all those people that we didn't manage to get to. We do, by all means, do contact, myself in the first instance, but I imagine Sarah's happy to field some questions as well, which I'll, forward on to her if they're curly ones that I can't answer. So by all means, do feel free to contact me on my email, which is just michael@alca, so alca.org.au. Otherwise, a big thank you very much again for your time. We'll make sure we send out the recording afterwards, and look forward to going on the journey of environmental law reform, both in South Australia and of course across the country with you. So thanks very much.